Tonight, let us journey far back in time to the banks of the Nile, where one of the greatest civilizations in history rose and flourished under the desert sun. Ancient Egypt, a land of pyramids, gods, and pharaohs, but also a land of ordinary people, living, loving, and desiring much as we do today. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds often turn to majestic temples, golden tombs, and hieroglyphs etched deep into stone. But beneath those grand achievements, there was another side of life, a quieter yet deeply human side. The intimate relationships, the bonds of marriage, the allure of beauty, and yes, the habits and customs of sex and love. For the Egyptians, sexuality was not hidden in shame. It was woven into the very fabric of their world, tied to fertility, religion, pleasure, and even politics. To them, desire was as natural as the flooding of the Nile and just as vital. Some of their customs feel surprisingly modern. Marriages built on companionship, poetry celebrating romance, even divorce when love soured. Others, however, strike us as strange, even bizarre. Unusual fertility rituals, curious contraceptives, and royal unions that defied our modern sense of family. Over the course of this story, we will explore both the ordinary and the extraordinary aspects of Egyptian sexuality. From the warmth of love poems whispered between young couples, to the sacred rituals honoring fertility gods, to the stranger habits that leave us wide-eyed centuries later. So settle in and allow yourself to drift back to a time when the desert sands were alive with music, laughter, and longing. The Nile flows gently in the distance, torches flicker in the night, and behind the walls of stone houses and palaces alike, the people of ancient Egypt lived their lives, lives filled with love, desire, and sometimes habits that might surprise us. In ancient Egypt, love and marriage were not only about passion, but also about stability, family, and the continuation of life. To the Egyptians, the home was the foundation of society, and marriage was its cornerstone. Yet, unlike in many other ancient cultures, marriage in Egypt was not a sacred ceremony. There were no priests presiding, no elaborate religious vows. Instead, marriage often began with something quite simple, two people agreeing to live together as husband and wife. For most, it was a practical arrangement. Families might encourage unions to strengthen ties, to combine land, or to ensure security. Yet surprisingly, affection played an important role too. Egyptian love poems, etched on ostraca and papyri, reveal men and women speaking of each other with tenderness and longing. They speak of stolen glances, the sweetness of a lover's embrace, the ache of absence. These verses remind us that beyond politics and contracts, Egyptians did indeed marry for love. Marriage, however, was not always permanent. Divorce was common, and in many cases it could be initiated by either the husband or the wife. If a union soured, if affection faded, or if trust was broken, it was possible to separate. Sometimes formal documents were drawn up, spelling out property rights and child custody, much like divorces today. Women could leave their husbands and still maintain their dowry or possessions, rights that would have shocked many cultures of the time. In the household, roles were defined but not entirely rigid. The husband often provided for the family, working the fields or laboring in craft. The wife oversaw the home, raising children, managing servants if the family could afford them, and ensuring the smooth rhythm of daily life. But women in Egypt were not as powerless as in many other ancient societies. They could own property, manage businesses, and appear in legal contracts under their own names. A wife was her husband's partner and, in some ways, his equal. Children were the heart of marriage, for fertility was deeply prized. Large families were seen as blessings, both practical and spiritual. Sons were expected to carry on the family's work, while daughters were cherished as future wives and mothers. Infertility was a painful burden, often leading to magical spells, remedies, and prayers to the gods of fertility. Inscriptions and amulets show parents pleading with deities to bless them with children. Polygamy existed, but it was rare among ordinary Egyptians. A farmer with modest land could hardly afford multiple wives. Among the pharaohs and elite, however, it was another story. A king might take several wives, both for political alliances and for the sheer display of wealth and power. Royal harems sometimes included dozens of women, each vying for influence, each hoping her son might inherit the throne. Despite the grandeur of palaces, though, the ordinary Egyptian marriage was simple. Two people sharing a home, raising children, and weaving their lives together beneath the eternal sun. Marriage contracts, when they existed, often spelled out mutual obligations. The husband would provide food and clothing, the wife would manage the household. These documents reveal not only legal obligations, but also the sense of partnership that lay at the heart of Egyptian family life. Love, too, was celebrated openly. In paintings, couples are shown sitting together, arms entwined, sharing food and drink. Husbands and wives appear in tomb inscriptions side by side, with words of devotion carved in stone. Even in death, Egyptians wished to be remembered not as solitary figures, but as part of a pair, companions for eternity. To be married in Egypt was not to enter a sacred bond under the gods, but to step into the fabric of society itself. It was practical, it was personal, and it was filled with both duty and affection. And while the pharaohs' unions were marked by politics and intrigue, the vast majority of Egyptians experienced marriage in its simplest form, as a partnership in the long journey of life. In ancient Egypt, sexuality was not hidden in secrecy or shame. Instead, it was bound up with the sacred, woven into myths, festivals, and rituals that linked desire with the cycle of life and death. To the Egyptians, sex was more than pleasure. It was creation itself, the divine spark that brought the world into being. One of the oldest myths tells of the god Atum, who created the universe through an act of self-pleasure. With his seed, he brought forth the first gods, Shu and Tefnut, who in turn gave birth to the air, the earth, and the sky. For the Egyptians, this was not crude, but powerful. Sexuality was the force from which everything emerged. Other deities embodied fertility and desire as well. Hathor, goddess of love and music, was often depicted with the horns of a cow and a sun disk, a symbol of nourishment and pleasure. She presided over festivals filled with music, dance, and drinking, where men and women alike sought her blessings for love and passion. Min, the god of fertility, was shown with an erect phallus, celebrated in rituals that prayed for bountiful harvests and fruitful unions. Perhaps the most famous tale is that of Isis and Osiris. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, Isis gathered the scattered pieces of her husband's body. In one version of the myth, his phallus was missing, lost to the Nile. Undeterred, Isis fashioned a substitute and used magic to conceive their son, Horus. The story was retold for generations, not as scandal, but as a testament to love, resurrection, and the enduring power of union. Fertility rituals were often exuberant, even bawdy by our modern standards. At festivals, crowds gathered to honor the gods with song, music, and intoxication. The festival of Hathor at Dendera was known for its wine, revelry, and symbolic gestures of fertility. What might appear as excess was, to the Egyptians, a joyful affirmation of life's abundance. Amulets and charms also reflected the link between sex and the divine. Small carvings of the god Bes, a squat, bearded figure, were placed in homes and bedrooms to ward off evil and protect childbirth. Amulets shaped like phalluses or female organs were worn for luck, fertility, and protection. Far from being taboo, sexual symbols were believed to channel divine power. Even the landscape of Egypt carried sexual meaning. The Nile itself was seen as a life-giving body, its annual flood likened to an act of fertilization, soaking the land and making it fruitful again. The union of male and female, of earth and water, echoed across the natural world as a cycle of creation and renewal. Temples, too, sometimes carried erotic symbolism. Reliefs might depict offerings linked to fertility, or priests might invoke gods with chants tied to procreation. While most temple rituals were solemn, the underlying belief remained. Sexuality was a sacred force, necessary for both human and cosmic balance. The Egyptians did not divide the sacred from the sensual. They believed that desire was not sinful, but divine, a reflection of the gods themselves. Myths, amulets, and festivals all carried the message that sexuality was a life-giving energy, one that could bless marriages, ensure children, and sustain the cycles of the natural world. To walk through an Egyptian festival was to see this belief in action. Men and women dancing, laughing, and embracing beneath the desert sky, offering their joy to the gods who shaped the world. It was an openness that may surprise us, but for the Egyptians it was simply the truth, that sex, like the Nile, was the source of life itself. Away from the temples and myths, sexuality in ancient Egypt was lived out in the rhythms of daily life. For most Egyptians, intimacy was tied to family, companionship, and the simple joys of being human. Yet, as in every society, there were rules, expectations, and quiet transgressions. Marriage was the foundation of sexual relationships, and while affection often played a role, fidelity was expected, at least in theory. Husbands were generally free to stray without serious consequences, while wives faced harsher judgments if they were caught in affairs. Adultery by a woman could result in humiliation, divorce, or punishment, depending on the family's standing. Even so, records suggest that infidelity was not uncommon, and the courts of Egypt heard cases involving broken trust, stolen lovers, and accusations of betrayal. Beauty and allure were important tools of seduction. Both men and women took great care in their appearance, using cosmetics not only for fashion but for attraction. Kohl eyeliner, malachite shadows, and red ochre lip paint were common, highlighting eyes and lips in ways still considered striking today. Perfumed oils were another staple, rubbed into the skin after bathing, leaving the body gleaming and fragrant. Some perfumes were even thought to contain aphrodisiac properties, stirring desire in the senses of those who caught their scent. Clothing also played its part. Linen, light and airy in the desert heat, could be spun sheer, clinging to the body and revealing its form. Artistic depictions often show women in tight dresses with plunging necklines, or men wearing kilts that emphasized strength and stature. Fashion, like cosmetics, was both practical and sensual. Sexual imagery appeared in art, though often subtly. Tomb paintings show couples embracing or holding hands, gestures of intimacy and partnership. Love poems speak of secret trysts, of longing glances at festivals, of the thrill of stolen moments. These texts reveal a society that, while structured, was not devoid of passion. Alongside these expressions of affection, however, existed more transactional relationships. While we would call it prostitution today, in ancient Egypt it was more complex, ranging from entertainers at banquets to temple-associated roles, to individuals who offered companionship for gifts or coin. Records hint that such practices were tolerated, if not fully respected, as part of the fabric of urban life. Fertility and family planning were constant concerns. For couples who wanted children, amulets, spells, and prayers to gods such as Hathor or Min were common. For those who sought to avoid pregnancy, more unusual methods were employed. Recipes survive in medical papyri describing mixtures of honey, acacia, and even crocodile dung as contraceptives inserted to block conception. Strange as these remedies sound to us, they reveal how resourceful Egyptians were in trying to control their family size. Sexuality was also linked to health and healing. Medical papyri describe remedies for impotence, infertility, and even excessive desire. Physicians, often blending science with magic, prescribed herbs, ointments, and incantations. A problem in the bedroom was not just personal, it was spiritual, physical, and social, demanding a solution. Despite rules, restrictions, and remedies, Egyptian society remained relatively open in its attitudes. Passion was not treated as shameful, but as natural. Love poems often use imagery of sweetness, fragrance, and nature, comparing lovers to lotus blossoms, rivers, or fruit. These verses suggest a culture that celebrated intimacy not only for reproduction, but also for pleasure and joy. In the end, everyday sexuality in ancient Egypt was a balance. The expectations of fidelity, the allure of cosmetics and perfume, the risks of scandal, and the pursuit of passion. It was both ordinary and extraordinary, woven into meals, festivals, and family life, but also alive in the whispers of lovers and the laughter of festivals. Strange and weird habits. While much of Egyptian sexuality feels familiar, the love, the marriages, the desire for children, there were also customs and practices that strike us today as unusual, even bizarre. Some were born from religious beliefs, others from royal politics, and a few from simple human inventiveness. Together, they paint a picture of a society both practical and peculiar in its approach to intimacy. Royal incest and the price of purity. Perhaps the most famous and most unsettling of Egyptian sexual customs was the practice of incest among royalty. Pharaohs were not considered ordinary men. They were the living embodiment of Horus, descendants of gods themselves. To preserve this divine bloodline, kings often married their sisters or daughters, imitating the sacred union of Osiris and Isis. This tradition was especially prominent during the Ptolemaic dynasty, where rulers like Ptolemy II married their sisters, and Cleopatra VII, yes, the Cleopatra, was wed to her younger brothers before pursuing her more famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But such unions carried a heavy price. Modern studies of mummies and historical records suggest that generations of inbreeding led to deformities, weakness, and poor health. Tutankhamun, one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, is a prime example. DNA analysis revealed that his parents were brother and sister. The young king suffered from a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and fragile bones, all likely consequences of close inbreeding. His early death at just 19 may also have been tied to these inherited conditions. So while incest preserved the idea of divine purity, it often weakened the very bloodline it sought to protect. What the gods may have blessed in myth, nature did not always support in flesh. Unusual contraceptives. Egyptians were nothing if not resourceful when it came to family planning, but some of their contraceptive methods strike us as downright odd. Recipes in surviving medical papyri describe mixtures of honey, acacia fibers, and even crocodile dung inserted as pessaries to block conception. The idea behind these mixtures was not entirely without logic. Honey is naturally antibacterial, and acacia, when fermented, produces lactic acid, which can reduce fertility. But crocodile dung? To us it sounds unhygienic and dangerous. To the Egyptians, however, it was symbolic, the strength and fertility of a crocodile harnessed as protection against unwanted pregnancy. Whether effective or not, it shows how creative and sometimes desperate couples could be in controlling their futures.
Erotic art and the Turin papyrus. Most Egyptian art is formal and symbolic, filled with gods, pharaohs, and rituals. Yet one rare artifact shows a very different side. The Turin erotic papyrus, discovered in fragments in the 19th century, depicts explicit sexual scenes alongside satirical images of animals engaged in human activities. It is one of the earliest known examples of erotic art in history. Scholars debate its purpose. Was it a humorous work meant to entertain? A private commission created for pleasure? Or a teaching tool demonstrating positions and practices? Whatever its origin, it reveals that the Egyptians were not shy about sexual imagery. They laughed at it, celebrated it, and found joy in portraying it. Fertility spells and magical remedies. Magic was woven into everyday life, and sexuality was no exception. Couples who struggled to conceive turned to spells, amulets, and charms. Some incantations involved reciting the names of gods while placing symbolic objects under the bed. Others required drinking mixtures of herbs, milk, and unusual ingredients that were believed to stir fertility. For men suffering from impotence, remedies ranged from herbal ointments to chants spoken over the phallus. Women who wanted to secure a lover's affection might carry amulets of Hathor, or even use spells designed to bind a man's desire. These practices blended medicine, superstition, and faith, showing how sexuality was never far from the realm of magic. Festivals of excess. Public festivals, too, carried sexual undertones. At celebrations of Hathor and Min, drinking and revelry flowed freely. Songs with erotic themes were sung, dancers performed provocative routines, and crowds joined in rituals meant to encourage fertility and abundance. To the Egyptians, such displays were not shameful but sacred. By embracing excess, they honored the gods who ensured their survival. It was a reminder that sexuality was not simply private, it was communal, divine, and a reflection of cosmic balance. Strange as these customs may appear to us, they reveal the same truth we've seen again and again, that the Egyptians saw sex as both natural and supernatural. It was medicine, magic, politics, and pleasure, all bound together. From incestuous dynasties weakened by deformity, to honey and crocodile dung contraceptives, to bawdy papyri and raucous festivals, their habits remind us of just how diverse and inventive human sexuality has always been. Love poems, passion and desire. Not all aspects of Egyptian sexuality were strange or unusual. Much of it was tender, poetic, and beautifully familiar. Beneath the grandeur of temples and the harshness of desert life, Egyptians expressed love with words and images that still resonate across millennia. We know this because fragments of their poetry survive. Delicate lines etched on shards of pottery, written on papyrus scrolls, or painted onto tomb walls. These love poems are among the oldest in the world, dating as far back as 1300 BCE, during the New Kingdom. They reveal that Egyptians, like us, longed, desired, and cherished their lovers with words that could melt even the hardest heart. One poem, written in the voice of a young woman, says, "I wish I were your mirror, so that you would look at me. I wish I were your garment, so that you would wear me." Another speaks of longing. "I lie here alone, but I dream of him, his arms around me, the sweetness of his embrace." These verses are filled with metaphors of sweetness, fragrance, and nature. Lovers are compared to lotus flowers, pomegranates, rivers, and fertile fields. Desire is described not as something sinful, but as something joyous and life-giving. What is striking is how openly women's voices appear in these poems. Many of the surviving verses are written in the first person from a woman's perspective, speaking directly about her longing, her delight, or her frustration. This suggests that women in Egypt were not entirely silenced in matters of love. They could articulate their desires, at least in literature. The poetry shows them as active participants in romance, not passive objects.
Egyptians also embraced the sensory world in their expressions of passion. Poems speak of the scent of myrrh, the taste of sweet fruit, the beauty of finely woven clothes, the sound of music drifting through the night. Desire was not abstract, it was embodied in all the senses, celebrated as a feast of life itself. Romantic love was not confined to the young either. Tomb inscriptions reveal couples who lived long lives together, wanting to be remembered side by side for eternity. Husbands praised their wives as beloved of the heart, while wives described their husbands as the one who makes my soul glad. For all the oddities of Egyptian sexual customs, their poetry reminds us that the essence of human love, the joy of companionship, the pain of longing, the thrill of desire, has changed little in thousands of years. Even playfulness appears in their verses. Some poems tease, describing lovers sneaking away to meet in gardens or at festivals, hiding their trysts from watchful parents. Others celebrate the beauty of the human body with frank delight, admiring strong arms, shining eyes, or graceful forms. The Egyptians did not divide romance from sensuality. Both were woven together, as natural and necessary as the Nile's flood. These poems are some of the most humanizing artifacts we have. They show us not kings or gods, but ordinary men and women, whispering their hopes, confessing their longing, and celebrating love in words meant for no one but each other. They remind us that beneath the rituals, the myths, and even the strange habits, Egyptians were people much like us, eager to love and to be loved in return. Scandals, myths, and court intrigue. For all their poetry, rituals, and celebrations of love, the Egyptians also lived in a world of intrigue, temptation, and scandal. Behind the stone walls of palaces and villas, the lives of nobles and pharaohs were filled with as much drama as any modern soap opera. Adultery, while frowned upon, was not rare. Court records and legal documents reveal cases where men and women were accused of betraying their spouses. For ordinary Egyptians, such scandals might result in divorce or loss of property. But in the royal courts, adultery could shake dynasties. Pharaohs were not only husbands and fathers, they were symbols of divine order. To betray a king's bed was not just a personal failing, it was a political act. One of the most notorious tales comes from the reign of Ramses III. According to records, a conspiracy was hatched within his own harem. Several women, angered by their positions and eager to see their sons elevated, plotted to assassinate the pharaoh. Their seductions and intrigues spilled into treachery, and though the plot ultimately failed, it shows how the passions of the palace could erupt into deadly consequences. Even mythology carried its share of scandal. The gods themselves were not free from tangled love lives. The rivalry between Seth and Horus, for instance, includes episodes filled with sexual tension and humiliation, recounted in myths that were at once sacred and shocking. To the Egyptians, such stories reflected not shame, but the complex interplay of power, dominance, and fertility that shaped both divine and human worlds. Pharaohs, too, were subjects of gossip. Akhenaten, the heretic king who upended Egyptian religion by worshipping a single god, Aten, was often portrayed in art with unusual androgynous features. Some scholars suggest his appearance was symbolic, while others argue it hinted at health issues or genetic consequences of incest. Either way, his unusual portrayal fueled speculation in both his time and ours.
And then there was Cleopatra, perhaps the most famous Egyptian queen of all. Her love affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony scandalized Rome. But in Egypt, they reflected a long tradition of queens wielding both political power and personal allure. Roman writers painted her as dangerously seductive, a woman whose charms could topple empires. To Egyptians, however, she was the last great ruler of their line, embodying both wit and passion. Even outside the royal courts, scandal thrived. Graffiti from towns like Deir el-Medina reveal gossip about affairs, desires, and rivalries among workers and their families. Just as today, communities whispered about who was faithful, who was not, and who had been caught in compromising situations. Sexuality in Egypt, then, was not always serene or sacred. It could be messy, dramatic, and even dangerous. Affairs led to divorces, conspiracies, and punishments. Myths blurred the lines between the divine and the scandalous. Queens and concubines alike found themselves at the center of political storms. Yet these stories, whether whispered in the marketplace or etched in myth, remind us that Egyptians were not so different from us. They laughed, gossiped, envied, and desired. Their scandals kept life exciting, and their myths gave meaning to the chaos of passion. In the end, even in the shadow of pyramids and temples, love and sex could topple kingdoms, ruin families, and rewrite history. As we leave the sunlit banks of the Nile and step back from the bustling streets of ancient cities, the picture of Egyptian sexuality becomes clearer. It was, like all things in their world, a blend of the practical, the spiritual, and the deeply human. For the Egyptians, love and desire were not cloaked in shame. They were celebrated in poetry, immortalized in myth, and woven into rituals that honored the gods. Marriage was both a partnership and a duty, sometimes filled with tenderness, sometimes with scandal, but always tied to the rhythm of family and fertility. Women held unusual freedoms compared to many other ancient cultures, giving them a voice in both romance and the law. Yet, alongside these familiar notes, there were practices that strike us today as strange. Pharaohs marrying sisters to preserve a divine bloodline. Strange contraceptives crafted from honey or even crocodile dung. Bawdy festivals where desire was let loose, and erotic art that shocked later generations of scholars. These habits may appear unusual to us, but to the Egyptians they were simply part of life, natural and necessary in a world where sex was seen as both sacred and powerful. And through it all, their humanity shines. In the love poems etched on papyrus, in the whispered scandals of palaces, in the amulets worn for passion and fertility, we see a people not so different from ourselves. They longed for love, struggled with fidelity, delighted in beauty, and laughed at the absurd. So, when we think of ancient Egypt, let us remember not only its monuments and pharaohs,
but also its lovers, its marriages, its secrets, and its laughter. For in their joys and their peculiarities, we find a reflection of our own.